Hidden behind a dense line of eucalyptus trees in the gentle sprawl of the San Fernando Valley sits a mansion that, for decades, was both fortress and pressure cooker. At first glance, 4641 Havenhurst Avenue looks peaceful, a wide, low-slung California home with sun-washed bricks, warm stucco, and long shadows stretching across its front lawn. But when the morning light hits it just right, the place seems to hold its breath, as if it remembers everything. Before Neverland Ranch, before the moonwalk, before the scandals and global hysteria, this was the Jackson family home, the headquarters of the dynasty, the one place where 8 children rehearsed, slept, fought, dreamed, and navigated the dangerous road from local talent show hopefuls to international icons. And long after Michael Jackson became the most famous entertainer in the world, this was the house he kept returning to, quietly, privately, and often at moments when his life was unraveling. On the outside, the mansion looks frozen in time, palm trees, a gated driveway, the faint sound of distant traffic humming along Ventura Boulevard. But inside, its walls witnessed a far more complicated story. A story of extraordinary ambition and unbearable expectations. A story of late-night rehearsals echoing through hallways, of private arguments behind closed doors, of pressure so heavy it clung to the windows like dust. This was the house where Michael learned discipline, perfectionism, and fear. It was the house where he first experienced the intoxicating promise of creativity and the suffocating weight of control. By the time he was a teenager, the mansion had already become a workshop, a battleground, and a refuge he could never fully escape. Today, the Encino estate sits quietly, tucked away from tour buses and the curious eyes of fans. But the truth is that the darkest chapters of Michael Jackson's personal evolution didn't begin in the glare of world tours or courtrooms. They began here, in the bedrooms, studios, stairwells, and private wings of a California mansion that shaped him long before fame finished the job. And to understand its story, we have to go back to the very beginning, long before the gate was installed, before the recording rooms, before the famous family routines that would define an era. The Encino mansion began as something far simpler. A quiet suburban dream purchased by a father who believed his children were on the brink of something extraordinary. In 1969, Joseph and Catherine Jackson were living in a cramped home in Gary, Indiana. The Jackson 5 had just begun to break through. Small gigs, local buzz, the faint outline of a future that seemed impossible. But when Motown signed the boys and whisked them to Los Angeles, everything changed. The family needed a place big enough for 9 people, stable enough for children entering the spotlight, and private enough to withstand a world suddenly interested in every detail of their lives. Encino offered all of that. Back then, the neighborhood was modest and family-oriented, a valley retreat miles away from Hollywood's chaos. The house they chose was not extravagant, not yet. It was a comfortable property on Havenhurst Avenue, sunlit, practical, and far from the luxury the world would someday associate with the Jackson name. But in Joseph Jackson's mind, it was a launch pad, and in Catherine's hands, it became a sanctuary. The early years were surprisingly ordinary. Children running through the yard, Catherine cooking in the kitchen, music drifting from bedrooms where instruments lay in piles. But beneath the surface, a transformation was already in motion. As the Jackson 5 catapulted into superstardom, the family outgrew the simple rhythms of suburban life. Fans gathered outside the gates. Cars slowed in front of the house. Reporters appeared unannounced. The home that was supposed to shelter them was suddenly the focal point of a growing cultural phenomenon. Yet this was also the house where Michael's earliest memories of safety lived. Catherine's softness, the laughter of siblings, the first sparks of creativity. He absorbed all of it, the warmth, the ambition, the tension, even as the walls around him began to shift. Because as the Jackson name grew, so did the house itself. And soon, Encino would become far more than a family home. It would become the center of a rising empire. By the early 1970s, the Jacksons' lives were accelerating faster than anyone could control. Hit records, television appearances, international tours, the family was becoming a phenomenon. and Los Angeles was watching closely. Amid all this noise, the Encino mansion offered something Joseph and Catherine desperately needed: a place to retreat, to regroup, and to rebuild the family structure fame was already threatening to pull apart. Encino was not Beverly Hills. It wasn't glamorous or flashy. That was exactly the point. Beverly Hills meant paparazzi. It meant industry people hovering around the children. It meant temptation, scrutiny, and a non-stop reminder that the entertainment world was always lurking outside the window. But Encino, tucked away on the quieter side of the valley, was protective. The air felt slower there. The neighbors minded their business. The streets were wide and shaded. A few miles away, Sunset Boulevard pulsed with ambition, but on Havenhurst Avenue the world softened just enough for a family on the rise to breathe. For Catherine, the home represented hope. Plenty of sunlight, enough space for her children to grow, and a large yard where she could plant the rose bushes she loved. For Joseph, it was strategy. He saw the house as a headquarters, a fortress from which he could manage rehearsals, discipline, press, and the family brand itself. He needed the kids focused, grounded, and protected from distractions, even if that protection came wrapped in strict rules. And for Michael, the mansion was something entirely different. It was a threshold, a halfway point between childhood innocence and the relentless demands of a career that had already taken root. At just 11 years old, he walked through that front door carrying the weight of expectations most adults could barely comprehend. This house would watch him transform from a boy who loved cartoon afternoons into a performer shaped by training, rhythm, control, and a growing desire for freedom. None of them could have predicted what the house would ultimately become: a maze of studios, security measures, additions, and emotional history layered over decades. But even in those early years, the Jacksons knew this wasn't just a home, it was the beginning of their empire. As the Jacksons' fame swelled, so did the Encino mansion. What began as a simple family home quickly grew into something resembling a small creative compound, part residence, part rehearsal space, part fortress. The house evolved not because the family wanted luxury, but because they needed room to contain the sheer force of their rising success. The first expansions were practical: more bedrooms, more privacy, more walls between the children and the crowds gathering outside the gates. But gradually, the changes became symbolic: physical manifestations of pressure, ambition, and the constant demand for productivity that defined the Jackson household. Rehearsal rooms were carved out of quiet spaces. A recording studio was built on the property so the children could practice late into the night without leaving home. The garage, once filled with bicycles and tools, became a work hub for music equipment. Even the hallways grew lined with plaques, awards, and reminders that every corner of the house was part of the family business. And then there was the renovation that changed everything: Michael's private wing. As he entered his late teens and early 20s, Michael's world expanded far beyond what the Encino mansion could contain. He was becoming a solo star with his own identity, his own needs, his own artistic vision. To give him space, or perhaps to contain him, the family remodeled a significant section of the home just for him. The new wing included a bedroom, a private sitting area, and a studio environment where he could write and experiment deep into the early morning hours. It was here, behind layers of closed doors, that Michael first tasted creative autonomy. Music poured out of those rooms, melodies scribbled in notebooks, tape machines humming, beats forming on the edges of sleepless nights. But even as this wing became a sanctuary, it all heightened the invisible tension running through the house. Michael was growing beyond Encino, but Encino was expanding to hold him. By the 1980s, the mansion was no longer just a home. It was a sprawling monument to ambition, a place stretched and reshaped by the weight of extraordinary talent and the cost of raising a superstar under one roof. From the outside, the Encino mansion looked calm: palm trees swaying, children coming and going, the warm glow of a valley sunset settling over the roofline. But daily life inside the house operated on a different rhythm entirely: a high-pressure blend of routine, discipline, artistry, and unspoken tension. Mornings often began with movement, voices drifting through hallways, choreography being rehearsed in living rooms, instruments being tuned in bedrooms where posters and toys shared space with amplifiers and microphones. The Jackson home was never quiet. It pulsed like a living studio, every corner vibrating with the expectation to perform. Catherine anchored the household with gentle hands. Her cooking filled the kitchen with warmth. Her presence softened the rigid structure Joseph enforced. She tried to preserve normal childhood moments, homework at the table, laughter in the yard, sibling games that had nothing to do with showbiz. But even her efforts couldn't fully hold back the momentum of the family's rising star power. Joseph ran the home like a training facility. Rehearsals were strict, standards were high. The children were expected to be ready, polished, perfect. Mistakes weren't just errors, they were threats to the future he envisioned for them. The pressure seeped through the walls, shaping the atmosphere of the house in ways that would stay with them for life. And in the midst of it all was Michael, the quiet child who felt everything. He experienced Encino with an intensity that no one around him fully understood. The house was both a playground and a workplace, a refuge and a cage. He loved the family dinners, the jokes shared between siblings, the rare days when the world felt small and safe. But he also felt the strain of constant rehearsals, the emotional distance between family members, and the growing expectation that he would become something greater than the group itself. At night, when the house fell finally, mercifully still, Michael often retreated to his private wing. He wrote, he sang, he dreamed of worlds beyond Encino, yet at the same time he clung to the familiar walls around him, the only place that had ever given him both sanctuary and structure. This was daily life inside the mansion, a delicate balance of harmony and tension, of love and pressure, of brilliance forming under conditions few outsiders could ever imagine. As Michael's fame exploded in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Encino mansion shifted again, not in structure, but in atmosphere. Something heavier began creeping through its rooms. The house that once buzzed with creative energy and childish noise now carried a tension impossible to ignore. And Michael, now a global star, found himself at the center of a storm, gathering both inside and outside the walls. The success of Off the Wall and later Thriller changed everything. Fame no longer lived outside the gate. It pressed against it. Fans camped on the sidewalk. Tour buses slowed for a glimpse. Reporters circled like hawks. The mansion became a fortress under siege from a world demanding Michael's time, his art, his presence, and eventually his privacy. Inside, the pressure was no lighter. Michael's growing independence began to clash with Joseph's control. Creative decisions turned into arguments. Recording sessions became battlegrounds between old expectations and Michael's evolving identity. And as the spotlight intensified, so did the cracks in the family dynamic. Michael withdrew deeper into his private wing. He worked alone more often. He avoided conflict when he could, but the house seemed to hold it anyway. In the way siblings tiptoed around one another, in the sharp silences that followed rehearsals, in the quiet acknowledgement that Michael was no longer just one of the Jacksons. He was the Jackson. And with fame came fear. The mansion's security measures increased. More cameras, more locks, more layers between the family and the outside world. Michael's childhood dreams of a carefree home faded into a maze of restricted areas, buzzing intercoms and the sense that even in his own house, someone was always watching. Then came the emotional strain, the loneliness of global fame, the pressure to maintain perfection, the exhaustion of becoming the most recognizable face on earth while still living under the roof where he had once been just a boy trying to please his father. Behind the cheerful exterior, the mansion carried secrets, unspoken resentments, private anxieties, and the growing realization that Michael was outgrowing the home that had shaped him. The Encino estate was no longer enough to hold him, and soon the next chapter would change everything. By the time the 1990s arrived, the Encino mansion felt less like a home and more like a crossroads, a place Michael kept circling back to even as every instinct pushed him toward escape. Neverland Ranch was already rising in the distance, a fantasy world he was building from scratch. But before he could fully step into that dream, he had to confront what Havenhurst had become. A house filled with memories, tensions, and unresolved wounds. The final chapter began quietly. Michael started spending less time in Encino, retreating instead to studios, hotels, and the growing sanctuary of Neverland. When he did return, he moved through the house like a ghost, drifting through rooms he no longer recognized. The once busy rehearsal spaces felt abandoned. The yard, once alive with siblings, seemed smaller. Even his private wing felt strangely distant, like a museum of a life he no longer lived. Tensions within the family deepened, arguments over business decisions, disagreements about finances. A growing divide between Michael's vision for his future and the expectations tied to the Jackson name. And hanging over all of it was Joseph's presence. Still authoritative, still influential, still echoing in the very structure of the house he had overseen for decades. Michael's absence created a vacuum in the mansion. Siblings came and went. Some rooms sat untouched. Others became storage for the overflowing business and financial documents tied to the family's empire. Slowly, the lively creativity that once defined the estate faded into a quieter, more strained existence. And then came the lawsuits, the financial battles, the spiraling pressures that pushed the Jackson family out and the house into instability. The Encino mansion was no longer just a home. It had become collateral in disputes, a symbol caught between love, legacy, and conflict. Eventually, Michael made the decision he had been avoiding for years. He moved out permanently. He didn't leave with ceremony or closure. He simply drifted away, carrying with him the weight of a childhood spent under its roof, and the understanding that the house had given him as much pain as it had protection. The Encino mansion didn't just lose its most famous resident, it lost its purpose. And in the years that followed, the estate would fall into a shadow far darker than anything the family had imagined. After Michael left for Neverland, the Encino mansion drifted into a strange limbo. Not abandoned, but no longer alive. It became a house defined by echoes, of rehearsals that once shook the floors, of arguments that lingered in the hallways, of dreams that had outgrown its walls. The brilliance and conflict that fueled the Jackson empire had burned intensely inside this home. And now all that remained were remnants scattered across rooms that felt too large, too quiet, and too heavy with memory. When Michael's career entered its most turbulent years, legal battles, financial crises, public scrutiny, the Encino estate surfaced again and again in the background. It became a bargaining chip in negotiations, a point of contention in lawsuits, and a reminder of unresolved family fractures. Even after Michael distanced himself from the property, the mansion remained tethered to him, part of a complicated web of decisions, debts, and loyalties. In the 2000s, cracks began to show in more ways than one. Sections of the mansion fell into disrepair, renovations stalled, rooms once filled with music equipment now collected dust. The once vaunted recording spaces became relics of an era that the family struggled to reclaim. And as Michael's personal challenges intensified, the Encino mansion reflected that instability, a physical symbol of a legacy under strain. When Michael passed away in 2009, the estate took on a different weight entirely. Fans gathered outside the gates, leaving flowers, candles, and messages as if hoping the house could hear them. For the public, this mansion represented the beginning, the birthplace of a superstar, the forge of a cultural icon. But for those who had lived inside, it was something more complex. A home that had sheltered extraordinary talent while simultaneously amplifying extraordinary pressure. In the years that followed, the property would undergo further changes, renovations, legal entanglements, shifting ownership within the family, but the heart of its story remained untouched. The Encino mansion was never just real estate. It was the crucible in which the Jackson identity was shaped. A place that witnessed the formation of legends, the erosion of childhood, and the emotional cost of global fame. Today, the house still stands behind its line of trees, quieter than it has ever been. The gates remain closed, the windows mostly dark, the echoes fading, but never fully gone. It doesn't boast the grandeur of Neverland or the global recognition of Michael's later life, yet its legacy is deeper, more human, more intimate, more haunting, because this is where it all began, where a family built an empire, where a superstar was shaped and shadowed long before the world ever knew his name, and the walls of the Encino mansion still remember every moment.